before we delve into the wonders of human evolution and the rise of civilization, let's take a step back, way back to a time when human existence was raw and untamed. Imagine a world where the concept of cities, of civilization itself, had not yet emerged. There were no towering skyscrapers, no written languages, no organized governments. There was only survival, a life governed by nature's rhythm, where each day was both a triumph and a struggle. This was the world of our ancestors, before the advent of agriculture, before the construction of cities, before the dawn of what we now call civilization. But what was life really like for them? At first glance, it may seem like a simple, almost primitive way of life, a time when humans were just part of the natural world, no different from the animals they hunted or the plants they foraged. But as we look deeper, we realize that this world, this era before civilization, was far more complex and profound than we might imagine. The people who lived during this time were far from the passive creatures we sometimes make them out to be. They were creative, adaptive, and deeply connected to the world around them. They had their own forms of communication, their own spiritual beliefs, and their own intricate social structures. They were building the foundations for the societies we would come to know, even though they had no way of knowing what their future held. We are talking about a time around 10,000 BCE, a moment in human history when the Earth was still recovering from the last ice age. The great glaciers were slowly retreating, revealing a landscape dramatically different from what had come before. Massive ice sheets had covered much of the northern hemisphere. But as the climate warmed, new environments began to emerge: lush forests, grasslands teeming with life, and fertile river valleys. These new ecosystems would eventually offer fertile ground for the earliest human societies, but for now, they were a world of possibility and danger, where life and death could change in the blink of an eye. Early humans living in these changing environments had no cities, no walls, no infrastructure to protect them. Their homes were temporary, built for mobility rather than permanence. The notion of ownership, of claiming land as one's own, was an idea as distant as the concept of the written word. These humans were hunters, gatherers, wanderers. They moved with the seasons, following the migration patterns of animals, the ripening of fruits, the flow of rivers. Their lives were inextricably linked to nature, and they had to learn to read the signs of the earth in ways that most of us have forgotten today. It is hard to imagine what it must have been like to live without the conveniences that we take for granted. No supermarkets stocked with food, no stores filled with clothes, no electronics to distract us. Instead, there was a world where survival depended on knowledge of the land and the elements, where every day was a test of skill, strength, and adaptability. The simplest task, finding food, creating shelter, staying safe, required the full attention of those who lived in this world. Yet, despite the hardships, there was a sense of freedom, an ability to roam and explore, to live without the pressures and restrictions that would come with the rise of cities. Life was communal, and it had to be. Without the social networks we have today, survival would have been impossible. Humans worked together to hunt large animals, share food, and protect one another. Small groups of people, bands of 10 to 50 individuals, would move through the landscape, their lives intricately tied to each other and to the world around them. These were not isolated individuals, but communities bound together by shared experiences and common goals. They did not just live in the world, they were part of the world, interconnected with the land, the animals, and the rhythms of nature. But as we imagine this world, we must remember that it was not all serenity. Life was hard, unforgiving, and dangerous. Every day was a battle for survival. The humans of 10,000 BCE faced constant threats from wild animals, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present danger of starvation. The risks were as much a part of life as the rewards. One successful hunt could sustain a group for days, while a failed expedition could mean the loss of crucial resources, pushing the group closer to desperation. And even as the earth warmed and new environments emerged, the world was still a harsh place, full of uncertainties and challenges. Yet, for all its danger, there was something beautiful about this way of life. In the absence of cities, of borders and divisions, There was a kind of purity in existence. Life was immediate. One lived in the moment, directly engaged with the environment, with the land that gave and took life in equal measure. There were no distractions, no complex systems of bureaucracy or commerce to get in the way. There was a simplicity to the human experience, but it was not an easy simplicity. It was a simplicity born out of necessity, a life where the basics, food, shelter, companionship, were constantly in flux, yet always deeply cherished. There was no concept of ownership, no sense of permanence. Homes were temporary, often constructed of whatever materials could be gathered: branches, hides, and grasses. These shelters were not designed to last. They were practical, built to serve a purpose in a world where stability was fleeting. When the seasons changed, so too did the human communities, moving with the cycles of nature. But despite their temporary shelters, despite their lack of permanent settlements, early humans left behind a profound legacy. Through cave paintings, carvings, and burial practices, we catch glimpses of their thoughts, their emotions, their spirituality. These were people who were beginning to understand their place in the cosmos, who felt the need to leave something behind, even if just an imprint in the earth, to prove they had existed. These early humans were not merely surviving, they were creating. Their art, their tools, their rituals all point to a kind of deep awareness, a sense of meaning that goes beyond basic survival. The need to express oneself, to communicate, to understand the world around them in ways that transcended the immediate concerns of food and shelter was already taking shape. This was not a society that existed purely to survive. It was one that sought to understand, to connect, to leave a mark. These first expressions of art, these first burial rituals, these first attempts to understand the mysteries of life and death would lay the groundwork for everything that would come after. And yet, despite all of this, these people knew that they were part of something larger. They were deeply connected to the land, to the animals, to the very fabric of life itself. Their existence was both fragile and profound, a delicate dance with nature that demanded respect, skill, and cooperation. They were the first people to shape the world, not through technology or architecture, but through their relationship with the earth and each other. In many ways, it is easy to romanticize this time, life in the wild, free from the constraints of modern civilization. But it is important to remember that it was also a life of uncertainty, hardship, and constant struggle. The world was a dangerous place, and the risks were ever present. But it was also a time of profound connection to the land, to each other, and to something deeper, something that transcended the physical world. These early humans did not just survive. They lived in a way that is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend today. As we begin this journey into the past, we are not just exploring a time before cities. We are also exploring a world that is fundamentally different from the one we know now, a world that exists in our memories, our myths, our subconscious. It is a world that reminds us of the fragility of human life, the depth of our connection to the natural world, and the power of the human spirit to adapt, survive, and create meaning in even the most challenging of circumstances. It is a world that still holds lessons for us today. The world we know today, with its bustling cities, intricate societies, and advanced technologies, often makes it difficult to imagine a time when none of this existed, a time when humans lived in small, scattered groups, their lives intricately woven into the rhythm of the earth. Before cities, before agriculture, before written language, there was only the primal struggle for survival. The world around 10,000 BCE was on the cusp of change. But for the humans living then, the boundaries between the wild and the domestic were still sharply defined. They lived in a time of flux, as the remnants of the Ice Age melted away, giving birth to a new era, one filled with possibility, yet still wild and unpredictable. In these moments of transition, humanity was poised between two worlds, the world of the nomadic hunter-gatherer and the world that would soon be born, one of settled agriculture, cities, and civilization. As the great glaciers retreated, they revealed landscapes that were as unfamiliar as they were fertile. The tundra, once covered in thick ice, transformed into grasslands, forests, and river valleys. These changes opened up new opportunities, for the animals humans hunted and the plants they gathered, but they also brought new challenges. The world was warming, and with it, the environment was shifting in ways that early humans could neither predict nor control. Yet, in this shifting landscape, the humans of 10,000 BCE were not passive observers. They were active participants, responding to the world around them with creativity, ingenuity, and adaptability. Their lives were shaped by their deep understanding of the environment and their ability to use the resources it offered. For these early humans, the world was not divided into nations or cities. There were no borders, no walls, no grand institutions. Instead, there were small, mobile groups, bands of people who moved with the rhythms of the seasons, following the migrations of animals, the ripening of fruits, and the flow of rivers. These groups ranged in size from small family units to larger bands, and they shared a deep connection to the land they inhabited. They were not isolated individuals, but communities bound together by a common purpose: survival. Their lives were simple, but that simplicity was also fraught with challenges. Every day was an exercise in adaptation as they navigated a world where the forces of nature were both their sustenance and their adversary. Life, for these early humans, was defined by a constant search for food and shelter. They were hunters, gatherers, and foragers, creatures whose existence depended on their ability to read the land and interpret its signs. The animals they hunted were both their sustenance and their companions in the struggle for survival. The forests, rivers, and plains they roamed were not mere backdrops to their lives, but active participants in their daily existence. Each landscape was a living entity, filled with hidden dangers and untapped resources, waiting to be discovered. The people of this time were not passive consumers of nature. They were intimately connected to it, with each member of the group playing a role in its complex web. At first glance, the lives of these early humans may seem harsh, even bleak. Their survival depended on the hunt, and their resources were limited to what the land could provide. There were no comforts of modern life, no supermarkets stocked with food, no shops filled with clothes. There were no homes that could withstand the elements for long, and no permanence in their way of life. Instead, their dwellings were temporary shelters, crafted from the materials they found around them: branches, hides, and grasses. These structures were made to serve a simple purpose: to protect them from the elements, from predators, and from the dangers that lurked in the wild. The homes they built were not places of luxury or comfort, but of necessity. They were not made to last. In this world, stability was fleeting, and life was always on the move. Yet, for all the hardships, there was a sense of freedom that came with this way of life. The nomadic existence of these early humans was not just about survival. It was also about movement. The world was open to them, and they were free to roam across vast stretches of land, unbound by the constraints of fixed settlements. Their lives were dictated not by the rules of a city or the authority of a ruler, but by the rhythms of nature itself. They followed the migrations of animals, the blooming of plants, and the flow of water. They knew when to move, when to stay, and when to hunt. Their lives were governed by cycles of seasons, of food, of birth and death. But this freedom came at a cost. The life of a nomad was filled with constant uncertainty. The world, while vast and open, was also dangerous and unpredictable. Resources were not always plentiful, and the animals they hunted could turn on them in an instant. Every day was a new challenge, a test of skill and resilience. The forces of nature, from wild storms to sudden droughts, were as much a part of their existence as the food they gathered. Yet, it was in this harsh environment that early humans learned to thrive. The struggle for survival was what shaped them, what forged their bodies and minds, and what created the foundation for the societies that would come later. These early humans were not alone in their struggles. They shared their world with the megafauna that roamed the earth: massive creatures like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant bison. These animals were both a source of sustenance and a constant threat. They hunted these creatures for food, using tools and weapons crafted with great care. But they also had to be cautious. For the animals they hunted were formidable opponents. A single misstep in the hunt could lead to injury or death. And yet, despite the dangers, the hunt was an essential part of their culture. It was a way of life, a rite of passage, and a deep connection to the land. As the earth warmed and the environment changed, these early humans began to adapt in ways that would shape the future of humanity. The world they lived in was not static. It was in constant flux, and they had to learn to move with it. As the glaciers melted and the climate shifted, new ecosystems began to emerge, offering new resources and new opportunities. But these changes were not without their challenges. The disappearance of some animals, such as the mammoths, meant that humans had to adapt their hunting strategies. The warming of the climate also led to changes in plant life, forcing humans to become more attuned to the rhythms of nature. They learned to read the signs of the land, the way the wind shifted, the patterns of animal migration, the growth of certain plants. They learned how to use the resources around them more efficiently, creating tools, weapons, and shelters that were better suited to their needs. This era, this moment in time, was a bridge between the wildness of the Ice Age and the beginnings of civilization. The people of 10,000 BCE were on the cusp of something greater, but they did not know it yet. They were living in a world that was both familiar and strange, a world that would soon give way to agriculture, permanent settlements, and the rise of cities. But for now, they were still part of the wild world. They still lived by the land, still moved with the seasons, still hunted and gathered. They were, in many ways, the last true nomads, people who existed in a world that was wild, unpredictable, and free. The world of 10,000 BCE was a place of profound beauty and profound danger. It was a world where survival was both a triumph and a struggle, where life was fragile and fleeting, and yet deeply meaningful. In many ways, the people of this time had an understanding of the world that we have lost in our modern lives. They lived in a world where everything was interconnected, where every action had consequences, and where the land, the animals, and the people were all part of a greater whole. As we look back at this time, we see not just a world of hardship, but a world of deep connection, a world where humans were still part of the natural world, still learning to shape their environment, still struggling to survive, and yet still profoundly alive in the moment. The story of these early humans is a story of adaptation, resilience, and, above all, a story of the human spirit in its purest form. The landscape around 10,000 BCE was drastically different from the world we know today. The great glaciers that had once covered much of the northern hemisphere were retreating, slowly but steadily, marking the end of the last ice age. With their departure, vast tracts of land that had been locked in ice for millennia were exposed to the warming rays of the sun. These newly revealed territories were transformed by a rapidly changing climate, giving birth to environments that were as unfamiliar as they were fertile. For early humans living in this period, these changes were both a blessing and a challenge, an opportunity for new life, but also a reminder of the fragility of existence. The retreat of the glaciers opened up a variety of new ecosystems that were teeming with life. The once icy tundra began to give way to expansive grasslands, dense forests, and lush river valleys. These new environments were perfect for the animals that had survived the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. Large herbivores like bison, elk, and deer found abundant grazing grounds in the warmer climates, while predators such as wolves and saber-toothed cats followed in their wake. Alongside these animals, the flora began to flourish, with trees, shrubs, and grasses that had once been dormant now pushing through the soil to reclaim the land. The planet was transforming, and with it, the possibilities for human life were expanding. Yet, this transformation was not without its complications. The retreat of the glaciers did not mean that life became easy. The climate was still volatile, and the Earth was going through a period of rapid adjustment. In some places, droughts would strike, while in others, heavy rains could turn the landscape into a swamp. There was no predictable pattern to the weather. As the world warmed, early humans were forced to adapt to new, shifting environments. In some regions, previously abundant resources were no longer available, while in others, new forms of life began to flourish. For those who could read the signs of the changing world, however, this period presented incredible opportunities. The key to survival was understanding the rhythms of the land, how the seasons changed, how the rivers swelled and receded, and how the plant and animal life responded to those changes. The hunter-gatherers who inhabited this world were deeply attuned to these shifts in the environment. They knew the movements of the animals they hunted, the migration routes of herds of mammoths and bison, the places where seasonal plants would appear, the patterns of the stars that guided them through the night. But the warming of the earth was also bringing a new set of challenges. The herds they depended on were migrating in ways they had not before, and some of the great beasts that had dominated the Ice Age landscape were slowly disappearing, forced out by changes in the environment. The mammoths, once abundant across the northern plains, began to dwindle, and the vast herds that had once provided a steady source of food and materials for tools and shelter were becoming rare. The disappearance of these animals presented a serious challenge to early humans, who had relied on them for both sustenance and survival. At the same time, the warming climate was creating new opportunities. As the ice melted, new territories opened up, and humans began to explore lands that had previously been inaccessible. The fertile river valleys, once locked beneath layers of ice, became prime locations for hunting and gathering. These areas offered an abundance of plant and animal life, but they also presented new risks. Flooding from the melting glaciers was common, and the shifting weather patterns could be unpredictable. Yet, for those who could adapt to these changing conditions, the rewards were great. The rise of river valleys and grasslands would eventually lay the groundwork for some of the first human settlements, but for now, they were still wild frontiers, untamed, full of both promise and peril. As the climate warmed, it also led to the rise of a more temperate world, a place where trees, shrubs, and flowers grew in abundance, providing new sources of food and materials. Early humans began to notice the subtle shifts in plant life, understanding that certain berries ripened at certain times of the year, that certain trees bore fruit that could be harvested in different seasons. The forested regions became a sanctuary, providing shelter, food, and materials for tools. The trees, once stark and leafless, began to bloom, filling the air with new scents and colors. It was a time of transformation, and early humans were deeply connected to this natural world in ways that were both practical and spiritual. But the changing climate also had its dark side. As the glaciers retreated, the Earth was becoming more vulnerable to extreme weather events. The temperature could swing wildly from year to year, creating conditions that were both unpredictable and dangerous. The sudden onset of a cold snap could devastate crops, while droughts could lead to famine. The land was no longer the predictable home it had once been. These fluctuations in the climate required early humans to remain flexible and adaptive, as they could never be certain of what the coming seasons would bring. They learned to work with the land, not to fight it. They became masters of their environment, knowing when to move, when to stay, and how to live in harmony with the ever-changing Earth. The climate change around 10,000 BCE was also responsible for the disappearance of many large species of animals, marking the end of the megafauna era. While the reasons behind the mass extinction are still debated, some scientists point to overhunting by early humans, while others attribute it to environmental shifts or a combination of both. One thing is certain: the loss of these creatures had a profound impact on early human societies. The disappearance of the mammoth, mastodon, and giant ground sloth forced humans to adjust their hunting practices and seek out new sources of food. No longer could they rely on the large, slow-moving animals that had been a staple of their diet. Instead, they had to turn to smaller game and more diverse plant life, adapting their strategies to new environments. This shift from hunting megafauna to smaller game was a pivotal moment in human history. It required innovation, new tools, and new strategies for survival. Humans began to refine their hunting techniques, developing smaller, more efficient weapons that could be used to hunt a wider range of animals. They also began to gather a broader array of plants, from berries to nuts to roots, expanding their diet and increasing their chances of survival. In many ways, the loss of the megafauna led to the development of more sustainable, diversified food sources, an adaptation that would prove crucial as humanity moved toward a new way of life, one that would eventually lead to agriculture. With the changes in climate and the environment came a deeper connection to the land. Early humans became more attuned to the subtle shifts in nature, developing a profound understanding of the rhythms of the earth. They learned to track the movements of animals, to read the sky for signs of weather, and to understand the cycles of plant life. In many ways, the environment was not just a backdrop to their lives. It was an active participant in their daily existence. Everything was connected. The land, the animals, the plants, and the people. Life was a delicate balance, and every change in the environment was a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. As the earth warmed and the environment shifted, early humans were forced to confront the realities of a changing world. The end of the Ice Age was not just a time of opportunity. It was also a time of uncertainty. The climate was unpredictable, and the animals they relied on for survival were disappearing. Yet, in this world of change, early humans were learning to adapt, to evolve, and to survive. The world they inhabited was not static. It was constantly shifting, constantly changing. And in the face of these changes, humans were becoming something more than mere survivors. They were becoming creators, innovators, and masters of their environment. They were forging the path toward a new era, one that would ultimately lead to the birth of civilization itself. Life for early humans around 10,000 BCE was fundamentally defined by movement through space, through seasons, and through time. The idea of permanence was foreign to them. They lived not in cities or villages, but in small, mobile groups that roamed the vast expanses of the earth. Their existence was not tied to fixed structures or territories, but to the rhythms of nature, the changing seasons, the migration of animals, the shifting of plant life. This nomadic lifestyle was born out of necessity, as humans were still primarily hunters and gatherers, dependent on the resources of the land for their survival. The need to follow the movements of animals, the ripening of plants, and the shifting climates meant that the world was not a place to settle down, but a place to explore, adapt, and survive. In many ways, the nomadic way of life was the ultimate expression of freedom. There were no walls, no borders, no rigid structures that confined them to one spot. Early humans were free to move wherever they needed to, following the trails of migrating herds or the patterns of fruit-bearing trees. They were free to explore new landscapes, discovering rivers and mountains, valleys and forests. Every journey was an adventure, a chance to experience the world in a way that was deeply connected to the land. In this world, the boundaries between human and nature were fluid, and the sense of belonging was not tied to a single location, but to the whole of the earth. Yet, this freedom came at a cost. Life in constant motion was not easy, and it was fraught with danger. While the nomadic existence allowed early humans to experience the world in ways that were untethered to permanent settlements, it also meant that survival was always uncertain. Every day was a struggle to find food, to protect oneself from predators, and to ensure that the group remained safe. The constant need to move meant that there was no chance to build lasting structures or accumulate wealth. There was no security in the form of permanent shelter or the comforts of home. Early humans had to be resourceful, making do with whatever they could carry and using the natural materials available to them to craft tools, build shelters, and create weapons. Despite these challenges, the nomadic lifestyle also fostered a deep sense of community. Small groups, typically consisting of family units, worked together to hunt, gather, and share resources. These communities were close-knit, built on trust, cooperation, and shared experience. The relationships within the group were vital to survival. A failure to work together could mean the difference between life and death. For early humans, cooperation was not just a social contract. It was a necessity. In a world where food was scarce and danger was constant, no one could afford to be an individualist. Every member of the group had a role to play, from the hunters who tracked the animals to the gatherers who foraged for fruits, nuts, and roots. These roles were not fixed but could change depending on the circumstances. A skilled hunter might become a gatherer during the off-season, and vice versa. The flexibility of the nomadic lifestyle was part of its survival strategy. The need for constant movement meant that early humans had to develop a deep knowledge of their environment. They needed to understand the landscape they were traversing, where to find water, where to hunt, where to gather plants. They had to be in tune with the rhythms of nature, knowing when to move and when to stay. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, creating a rich oral tradition of stories and teachings that helped guide the group through the challenges of each season. The relationship between humans and the environment was symbiotic. Humans shaped the land by hunting animals and foraging plants, but the land, in turn, shaped humans, dictating where they could live, where they could hunt, and when they could move. This reciprocal relationship was at the heart of the nomadic lifestyle. The mobility of early humans also had a profound impact on their social structure. The small, tight-knit groups that lived in constant motion were egalitarian, with less social stratification than the societies that would later emerge in sedentary civilizations. There were no great hierarchies or kings, no cities with rulers and subjects. Instead, leadership was often fluid and based on skill, knowledge, and experience. The strongest and most skilled hunters might lead the group in times of danger, while the wise elders might offer guidance on when and where to move. In this way, leadership was not fixed, but dependent on the needs of the group at any given moment. There was a profound sense of equality among group members, with everyone contributing to the collective survival. This structure allowed for a kind of social cohesion that would be difficult to replicate in larger, more complex societies. However, as the environment changed and the needs of the group grew more complex, this simple, egalitarian structure began to face challenges. The growing demands of survival in an increasingly unpredictable world meant that the early humans had to evolve new ways of organizing themselves. The nomadic lifestyle began to give way, slowly but inevitably, to a more settled way of life. The shift was gradual, but it was becoming clear that to thrive in the changing world, humans would need to begin forming permanent settlements. This transition would take thousands of years, but the seeds of sedentism were being planted. The nomadic groups would still roam the land, but they would eventually start to build small, temporary shelters that would later evolve into more permanent homes. The idea of owning land, of having a place to call home, would begin to take root. For now, though, they were still living in a world where every day was a journey, and the idea of permanence was as foreign as the concept of cities. Despite the eventual rise of sedentary societies, the legacy of the nomadic way of life is still present in the modern world. Many indigenous cultures today still follow traditional nomadic lifestyles, moving with the seasons and the rhythms of nature. The principles of cooperation, egalitarianism, and a deep connection to the land continue to resonate in these cultures. Even in the most urbanized parts of the world, there are echoes of the nomadic past in our desire for exploration, adventure, and freedom. The modern world may be built on cities and technology, but the deep, primal connection to the earth that characterized the lives of early humans is still with us. We may no longer live in the same way as our ancestors, but the nomadic spirit, the drive to explore, adapt, and survive, continues to shape the human experience. The nomadic lifestyle also had a significant impact on the development of early human culture. The constant movement from place to place meant that early humans had to develop a flexible, adaptive way of life that could be carried from one environment to the next. This adaptability fostered a creativity that would prove essential to survival. Early humans created tools that could be used in a variety of contexts, from hunting weapons to shelters to clothing. These tools were often multifunctional, designed to serve a variety of needs as the group moved through different landscapes. The ability to innovate and adapt to new situations was not just a survival strategy, it was a cultural necessity. The tools, art, and rituals created by these early humans reflected a society that was constantly in flux, yet deeply connected to its environment. In many ways, the nomadic lifestyle was a precursor to the cultural and technological innovations that would later define human civilization. The need for mobility and adaptability led to the development of early technologies like the spear, the atlat, a throwing stick, and the bow and arrow. These tools, not only allowed humans to hunt more effectively, but also helped them to create more efficient and durable shelters, clothing, and tools. The creation of art, from cave paintings to carved figurines, was another form of expression that reflected the nomadic way of life. These artworks were not just decorative, they had meaning, and they told the stories of the people who created them. They were a way of connecting with the world, of understanding the mysteries of nature, and of recording the experiences of the group. The nomadic way of life was not just about survival. It was about living in a world that was constantly changing, constantly presenting new challenges and opportunities. It was a life lived on the edge, where the only certainty was uncertainty. Early humans who lived in this world were not passive beings. They were active participants in the shaping of their environment, in the creation of culture, and in the evolution of human society. Their nomadic existence laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of cities and civilizations. But it was also a world unto itself, one that was defined by movement, flexibility, and a deep connection to the land. In many ways, the nomadic way of life was the most primal and pure expression of human existence, a life lived in harmony with the earth, a life where survival was not just about finding food, but about creating meaning, forming bonds, and adapting to the ever-changing world. The world in which early humans lived around 10,000 BCE was one that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They existed in an environment that was constantly changing, and their survival depended entirely on their ability to adapt to these shifts. The end of the Ice Age had brought about significant changes in the climate, the flora, and the fauna, and the people of this time were intimately connected to the land they inhabited. As the world transitioned from the cold, harsh conditions of the Ice Age to the warmer, more temperate environments of the Holocene, humans faced the challenge of learning to live within these new ecosystems. They were no longer just surviving in a world that was governed by ice and snow, but thriving in one that was alive with the potential of growth, abundance, and opportunity. However, this new world was not without its dangers. The sudden climate shifts that followed the retreat of the glaciers created an unstable environment, one where resources could be abundant one year and scarce the next. The landscape was no longer predictable, and the once immense herds of mammoths, mastodons, and other megafauna that had dominated the Ice Age were beginning to disappear. The reasons for this extinction are still debated. Some argue that it was due to the climate changes, while others suggest that human hunting practices played a role. But what is certain is that the disappearance of these large animals marked a turning point for early human societies. Without the massive herds of megafauna, humans had to find new ways to feed themselves, to adapt their diets, and to shift their patterns of hunting and gathering. As the environment changed, so too did the behaviors and strategies of early humans. They had no choice but to evolve, to become more resourceful and creative in the ways they interacted with the world around them. The large, slow-moving animals that they had relied on for food, materials, and clothing were no longer available in the same numbers, and humans began to turn their attention to smaller prey. The hunt became more diversified, as humans sought out smaller mammals, birds, and fish to feed their growing groups. They also turned to plant life for sustenance, discovering new types of fruits, seeds, and tubers that could be harvested and consumed. This shift in diet, though born out of necessity, would eventually lay the groundwork for the development of agriculture. But the change was not just in the way they gathered food, it was in the way they lived. No longer were they simply wandering from place to place in search of resources. Early humans began to settle into specific areas for longer periods of time. These semi-permanent settlements were still mobile in the sense that they could be abandoned and moved if necessary, but they were more stable than the purely nomadic lifestyles that had come before. The rise of these settlements marked the beginning of a transition from a purely hunter-gatherer society to one that was starting to embrace the idea of staying in one place for extended periods of time. This shift would, in time, lead to the development of villages, towns, and eventually cities, but it was a gradual process, one that took thousands of years. The seeds of agriculture, of growing food rather than simply gathering it, were planted during this time. Early humans began to recognize the potential of the land around them. They began to understand the seasonal patterns of plants, the cycles of growth and harvest, and the ways in which they could manipulate the environment to their advantage. The first evidence of intentional planting of seeds, of cultivating the land for food, appears around this time. It was not an immediate shift. The practice of agriculture developed slowly, over generations, but it was a fundamental change in the way humans interacted with their environment. They were no longer just scavenging from the land, they were starting to shape it. At the same time, these early settlers began to develop more sophisticated tools and techniques to help them adapt their changing environment. The tools of the previous era, like spears and flint blades, were refined and made more efficient. Humans began to craft more specialized tools for specific tasks, tools for digging, for weaving, for making pottery. The process of creating these tools required knowledge of materials, craftsmanship, and ingenuity. The development of such tools was not just about survival, it was a reflection of the growing complexity of human life. As humans settled into more permanent sites, they began to develop more complex social structures and systems of organization. No longer was the group simply a collection of individuals working together to hunt and gather. With the advent of semi-permanent settlements, humans began to form more intricate social networks. And with these networks came new roles, new responsibilities, and new ways of thinking about community and cooperation. The shift to semi-permanent settlements also meant that early humans were beginning to establish a more intimate relationship with the land. They were starting to mark their territory, to demarcate areas where they would live, hunt, and gather. These territories were not just physical spaces, they were also cultural ones. Over time, the people of a particular region would develop a deep attachment to their land, to the resources it provided, and to the memories and stories that became woven into the fabric of the landscape. The land, once something to be moved through and left behind, began to take on a new significance. It became home. This changing relationship with the land brought about changes in the way early humans thought about ownership and resources. Before, the concept of land ownership was a foreign one. Humans simply moved through the world, taking what they needed and leaving when it was no longer sustainable. But as people began to settle in specific locations for longer periods, the concept of ownership began to emerge. It was not yet the full-fledged system of property rights that would emerge with the rise of civilization, but it was a beginning. The seeds of agriculture also planted the seeds of something else, the idea of surplus. In a world where survival had once meant merely gathering enough to eat day by day, humans began to create excess. The ability to store food, to harvest more than was needed in the moment, marked another fundamental shift. For the first time, humans had the opportunity to think beyond immediate survival. The ability to store food also meant that early humans were no longer as dependent on the unpredictable cycles of the seasons. They could begin to stockpile resources and create reserves, ensuring that they could survive the leaner months or years when food might be scarce. The idea of surplus was not just about survival, it was also about security. It was a way of preparing for the future, of creating a sense of stability in an environment that was anything but stable. With this surplus came a new understanding of wealth and resources, things that could be traded, shared, and passed down to future generations. But while early humans were becoming more settled and beginning to shift toward an agricultural lifestyle, the world around them was still full of uncertainties. The climate was unpredictable, and the land was still in flux. The megafauna that once roamed the earth had disappeared, and new species of animals were emerging to fill the void. These changes were not just biological, they were cultural as well. The way humans interacted with the land, with each other, and with the animals they relied on was evolving. No longer were they just scavengers or opportunistic hunters. They were becoming stewards of the land. The foundations for civilization were being laid, not just in the form of agricultural innovations, but in the form of new social structures, new systems of trade and barter, and new ways of understanding the world around them. As humans began to settle and form more permanent communities, they also began to build a deeper connection to the world that they were shaping. The transition from a purely nomadic existence to one that embraced semi-permanent settlements marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. It was a time of adaptation and transformation, as humans learned to live within the changing environment, while also beginning to shape that environment to suit their needs. It was a time of experimentation, of innovation, and of discovery. And though they could not yet foresee the civilizations that would arise in the centuries to come, the people of this time were laying the groundwork for a future that would forever alter the course of human history. As early humans moved through the landscape, adapting to the shifting climate and environmental changes around 10,000 BCE, they began to develop new relationships with the world around them. Their nomadic existence had taught them to understand the rhythms of nature. When the animals they hunted migrated, when the plants they gathered ripened, and when the weather turned harsh. But as the climate warmed and the environment became more temperate, they were now encountering the challenge of finding new ways to sustain themselves. Great herds of megafauna, which had once been abundant, were beginning to disappear. The mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison, which had been integral to their diet and way of life, were no longer as plentiful. This sudden scarcity forced early humans to change their hunting strategies, adapt their diets, and rely more on the environment's new offerings. The warming climate and the changing landscapes created new ecosystems, bringing with it a host of smaller, more agile animals that had to be hunted in new ways. Gone were the days when large herds of slow-moving creatures could be pursued with spears and arrows. Now, early humans had to track fast-moving prey, learning new hunting techniques and devising more efficient tools. The hunt, once a matter of following vast herds across the plains, became more about precision, patience, and strategy. The tools that had once been used to bring down large game now had to be adapted for smaller animals. Early humans began to craft more specialized weapons, lighter, sharper spears, bows, and arrows that would allow them to hunt smaller, more elusive prey. The need for mobility, flexibility, and resourcefulness was greater than ever. While the hunt remained central to their survival, early humans also began to diversify their food sources. They had learned to gather fruits, nuts, seeds, and roots. But now they began to pay closer attention to the ways in which different plants grew and interacted with the landscape. They discovered which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which could be eaten raw, and which needed to be cooked or processed. They began to recognize the cycles of plant life, knowing when certain fruits ripened and when roots could be dug up. They learned how to harvest without depleting the land, allowing plants to regenerate for the next season. The knowledge of the land, of the plants and animals that lived within it, was crucial to their survival. This knowledge was passed down through generations, creating a rich oral tradition of storytelling, teaching, and learning. But as early humans began to rely more on the land and its resources, they also began to develop new tools and technologies that would help them manage these resources more effectively. The tools of the hunter-gatherers were becoming more specialized and refined. The stone tools used to butcher animals and prepare food were increasingly sophisticated, with sharper edges and better designs. Humans began to develop tools for processing plant life, such as grinding stones and mortars for crushing seeds and nuts. These tools allowed them to extract more food from the land, increasing their ability to store food for leaner months and to develop more complex diets. These innovations also reflected a growing understanding of the land and its potential. Humans were not just foragers anymore. They were beginning to actively shape their environment. Alongside the evolution of hunting and gathering practices, the gradual transition to a more sedentary way of life began to take root. As the climate became more predictable and the availability of food more reliable, early humans started to spend longer periods in one place. They began to establish semi-permanent settlements, moving less frequently than they had in the past. These settlements, while still transient compared to later villages or cities, represented a major shift in human behavior. For the first time, humans were beginning to put down roots, not in the sense of establishing permanent towns or cities, but in the sense of staying in one location for extended periods. This shift towards semi-permanence was closely linked to the changes in their relationship with food. As they learned to cultivate the land, even in rudimentary ways, humans could begin to rely less on constant movement and more on the food that they could grow or gather in one area. The first evidence of early forms of agriculture, such as the cultivation of grains and the domestication of plants like barley, wheat, and legumes, appeared around this time. Though agriculture was still in its infancy, It marked the beginning of a profound shift in the way humans interacted with their environment. The first grains were harvested, not just as wild plants, but as crops intentionally planted and nurtured by humans. The transition to more permanent settlements was a slow and gradual process, and it was not just about food, it was about the way that humans began to think about their environment. As they became more reliant on the land, they also began to develop a deeper connection to it. They began to form attachments to specific places, the rivers where they fished, the fields where they harvested plants, the forests where they gathered wood. The landscape was no longer something to simply pass through. It became a home, a place that they could come to know intimately. These semi-permanent settlements allowed for the development of new social structures as well. As groups began to stay in one place for longer periods, there was a need for more organization. Roles within the group began to become more defined. Some individuals became specialists in certain tasks, craftsmen who made tools, hunters who specialized in smaller prey, gatherers who focused on certain plants. The development of these specialized roles was a sign that human societies were becoming more complex. But while some early humans were beginning to settle in one place, others still followed the ancient nomadic patterns, moving from place to place as their ancestors had done. The tension between the nomadic lifestyle and the emerging settled way of life was a defining feature of this period. Those who chose to remain mobile continued to roam the land, hunting and gathering as they always had. But with the rise of agriculture and semi-permanent settlements, a new way of life was emerging, one that would eventually lead to the birth of villages, towns, and eventually cities. Over time, those who had embraced the more settled lifestyle would gain an advantage. The ability to control food production, to store surpluses, and to settle in fertile areas meant that these groups could begin to grow in size and complexity. With the rise of sedentary communities came a new way of thinking about resources. The idea of owning land, of claiming a portion of the earth for personal use, began to take shape. Early humans who had once lived in harmony with the land, moving through it freely, began to form deeper connections to specific plots of earth. The land was no longer just something to be used for hunting and gathering. It was something to be cultivated, protected, and passed down through generations. This connection to the land and the idea of owning it would eventually lead to the development of property rights, the foundation of social and economic structures that would define later civilizations. At the same time, the rise of agriculture allowed for greater population growth as food production became more reliable, and as humans began to settle in one place for longer periods, populations could expand. This created new pressures on resources and space. With larger groups of people living in one area, the need for organization and cooperation became even more important. These early communities began to develop more complex social structures, with leadership roles emerging, sometimes based on age, wisdom, or prowess in hunting and gathering. As these communities grew, so did their need for tools, goods, and services. This marked the beginning of trade, humans exchanging what they had in abundance for what they lacked. This exchange of goods, from food to tools to raw materials, helped establish the early foundations of commerce. While these changes were taking place, the spiritual and cultural aspects of life were also evolving. Early humans had always been connected to the land, but as they began to settle and build more permanent homes, they began to develop deeper spiritual and cultural practices tied to their environment. The land, the animals, and the forces of nature became central to their belief systems. Rituals, ceremonies, and spiritual practices began to emerge, many of which were closely tied to the cycles of the seasons, the planting and harvesting of crops, and the patterns of migration. These early religious practices were not just a reflection of their understanding of the world, they were also a way of bringing the community together, of reinforcing the bonds that held the group together. As early humans began to settle, they also began to transform their environment. They shaped the land, not just for food, but for shelter, for protection, and for spiritual reasons. The rise of semi-permanent settlements marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one that would eventually give rise to the great civilizations of the future. But for now, it was a time of experimentation, of adaptation, and of learning. It was a time when humans were beginning to understand the full potential of the land, the resources it offered, and the ways in which they could shape their future. In the process, they laid the foundation for everything that would come after. The seeds of agriculture, the rise of settled communities, and the growing complexity of social structures were all parts of the same story, the story of humanity's gradual shift from a nomadic existence to the birth of civilization itself. As humans began to settle into more permanent or semi-permanent habitats around 10,000 BCE, something remarkable began to unfold, an evolving understanding of social dynamics that would shape the course of history for millennia. The shift from a primarily nomadic existence to a more sedentary lifestyle was more than just a change in how people acquired food. It signaled the beginning of a transformation in the very structure of human society. In a world still reeling from the disappearance of megafauna and the uncertainty of a rapidly changing climate, humans were forced to adapt, not just in terms of how they interacted with the environment, but also in how they interacted with each other. With the advent of agriculture, semi-permanent settlements, and specialized roles, humans were beginning to develop social structures that would set the foundation for the rise of complex societies and civilizations. At the heart of this transformation was the necessity of cooperation. As groups began to settle in one place for longer periods, the nature of survival shifted. No longer was it enough to simply rely on individual skill and resourcefulness. With the increase in population density, people needed to work together more closely, pooling resources and knowledge in order to thrive. Cooperation became the cornerstone of human survival, and this cooperation required new forms of social organization. Within these early settlements, roles became more defined. Specialization of labor, a concept that would later fuel the rise of more complex economies, began to emerge. Early humans, who had once been generalists, adapting to a range of tasks from hunting to gathering to shelter construction, began to focus their efforts on specific tasks. Some became skilled farmers, others took on roles as toolmakers, and still others became more involved in the gathering of specific plant species. These specialized roles were vital, not only for the efficiency of the community, but also for the social cohesion of the group. Each individual had a specific responsibility, and their survival, as well as the survival of the group, depended on the successful execution of these tasks. However, this specialization of labor created new challenges. As different members of the community began to focus on different tasks, they were no longer fully self-sufficient. This led to the creation of a new form of exchange trade. Humans began to barter their surplus goods for items they lacked. For instance, farmers who grew grains or cultivated vegetables would trade with those who hunted or fished, while toolmakers might exchange their products for food or clothing. The rise of trade was not only a matter of necessity, it also marked the beginnings of a more complex system of social relations, one that began to include notions of value, exchange, and inequality. As trade routes developed, certain individuals or groups began to accumulate wealth, and with wealth came power. This emergence of economic disparities would later lead to the development of hierarchies and classes within societies. While specialization and trade were critical developments, they were also accompanied by other, equally significant social shifts. With the rise of semi-permanent settlements came a more complex system of governance. In small, nomadic groups, leadership was often fluid, based on the individual's ability to provide for the group or protect them from danger. But in settled communities, as groups grew larger and more complex, leadership became more structured. Elders, warriors, or individuals with specialized knowledge, such as skilled farmers or toolmakers, may have taken on leadership roles, offering guidance in exchange for respect and support. In some cases, these leaders were not simply chosen for their abilities, but because of their kinship or familial ties. This was the beginning of the development of authority figures, whose power was tied not just to their skill, but to their position within a network of relationships. This change in governance also began to alter the way humans thought about power and authority. In small nomadic groups, there was little need for complex systems of governance. People relied on consensus or the authority of those with the most experience or knowledge. But with the advent of larger, more permanent settlements, it became necessary to establish more formalized systems of leadership. This marked the early emergence of what would later become kingdoms, chiefdoms, and states. Leaders may have had the authority to make decisions regarding the distribution of resources, the defense of the community, and the resolution of disputes. Over time, these roles would become more formalized, and the concept of a ruling class, those with political and economic power, would emerge. As these changes in leadership and governance began to take shape, so too did changes in the role of women and families within society. In early hunter-gatherer groups, gender roles were often more fluid. Both men and women participated in a range of tasks, from hunting to gathering, to caring for the young. But with the rise of agriculture and the development of more permanent settlements, gender roles began to solidify. Farming, with its demands for continuous labor, became largely the responsibility of women, while hunting and the defense of the community often remained the domain of men. This division of labor, although practical, began to reinforce the social hierarchies that were emerging. Men became more associated with power and decision-making, while women's roles were increasingly tied to the home and family. This shift in gender dynamics was just one part of the broader pattern of social stratification that was beginning to take shape. The creation of more permanent settlements also led to the rise of early forms of religious practices. In the nomadic world, religious beliefs were often animistic in nature, with humans believing that the land, the animals, and the elements were imbued with spiritual significance. But with the transition to more permanent homes, humans began to form more structured belief systems. These new religions were often closely tied to the land and to agricultural practices. The rising importance of farming meant that people's survival now depended on the fertility of the soil and the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. As a result, many early religious practices became focused on fertility and the worship of gods or spirits associated with the earth, water, and the harvest. Religious rituals, often involving offerings and sacrifices, became important ways of ensuring the prosperity of the community. As the communities grew, so did the complexity of their religious beliefs, eventually giving rise to temples, shrines, and ceremonial practices. The creation of semi-permanent settlements also led to the development of infrastructure, early forms of roads, dwellings, and storage facilities. The need to store surplus food from the harvest or protect against the elements gave rise to new forms of construction. The shelters built in these early settlements were more durable and permanent than the temporary structures used by nomads. People began to build homes using mud, stone, or timber, creating larger, more complex living spaces. Storage facilities also became necessary to hold food and other goods, and with these came the need for greater organization. In some cases, these storage areas would later evolve into early forms of marketplaces or trade hubs, where goods could be exchanged between different groups. In the context of these settlements, the concepts of territory and ownership also began to take on new significance. Whereas nomadic humans had roamed freely, constantly moving from place to place, the shift to permanent settlement created the need for clear boundaries. These boundaries were not just physical, but also social. As humans began to lay claim to land, they developed new ways of thinking about ownership, about who could claim a piece of the earth, and what it meant to have a place to call home. This idea of land ownership, though rudimentary in its early stages, would eventually become one of the central pillars of human societies. The concept of property would later evolve into a legal and economic system that would define much of the structure of civilizations. As all of these changes unfolded, new social structures, specialized labor, gender roles, religious practices, and early forms of governance, humans were becoming something more than just a species that had learned to survive in a rapidly changing world. They were beginning to lay the foundation for the rise of civilization. The process of settling down, of building communities and societies, was a slow and complex one, marked by constant adaptation and innovation. And though it was still a long way from the cities and empires that would come thousands of years later, the seeds were being planted. In this new world, humans were no longer simply surviving. They were beginning to build the structures that would define their future. It was a time of profound change, one that would reshape not just how humans lived, but how they thought, believed, and interacted with one another. These early settlements were not just the beginning of agricultural societies, they were the birthplaces of everything that would follow. As human societies around 10,000 BCE began to settle into more permanent or semi-permanent communities, the transformation in how they lived extended beyond food production and social organization. It reached into the very fabric of their daily lives, influencing their relationships, the way they viewed the world, and the long-term sustainability of their existence. The move from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles to sedentary agricultural ones brought with it new challenges and opportunities that forced early humans to develop more complex strategies for survival. This shift was not a singular event, but a series of interwoven changes that unfolded gradually, shaping the human experience in profound ways. The first major change that accompanied the rise of settled life was the increasing need for resource management. In a hunter-gatherer society, resources were often acquired in a more transient and opportunistic manner. People moved with the seasons, following animal migrations, and gathering plants as they appeared in their natural habitats. There was little concept of long-term storage, and even less concern for the sustainability of the land, because people constantly moved from place to place. The land was treated as something temporary, as a resource to be used and then left behind. However, with the advent of permanent settlements and agriculture, humans had to think differently about their environment. The growing reliance on agriculture meant that early humans began to interact with the land in a much more intentional way. They learned how to cultivate crops, how to manage the soil, and how to plan for future harvests. This required a far deeper understanding of the land than had been necessary before. It was not enough to simply pick wild plants or chase after herds of animals. Early farmers had to pay attention to seasonal cycles, to rainfall, to the condition of the soil, and to the animals that lived in and around their fields. These farmers had to become stewards of the land, carefully tending to their crops, learning to rotate them, and finding ways to improve soil fertility. Alongside the careful management of crops, humans also began to develop tools and technologies to help with farming and storage. In addition to the basic hand tools used for planting and harvesting, early agricultural societies began to develop irrigation systems, which allowed them to control the flow of water to their crops. The creation of water channels and the use of natural springs for irrigation were some of the earliest forms of technology that had a profound impact on human civilization. With the ability to control water, early farmers were able to grow crops in regions that would otherwise have been unsuitable for farming. This control over the land and the ability to manipulate natural resources allowed early humans to settle in places where they would not have been able to do so otherwise. However, the need to manage food production also led to the development of new societal roles. The concept of ownership, which had not existed in the same way among nomadic groups, began to take root as humans began to build permanent homes, establish boundaries, and accumulate goods. The idea of private property emerged. In agricultural societies, land became a valuable asset that could be passed down through generations. Ownership of land and the crops that grew on it was central to the social organization of these communities. This created a new dynamic between those who owned the land and those who worked it. While the larger community was still dependent on cooperation and collective effort, the division between landowners and laborers began to emerge, setting the stage for future social hierarchies. In addition to these practical concerns, the rise of settled life also led to the development of new ways of thinking about time and labor. In a nomadic society, the passage of time was often marked by seasons, by the movements of animals, and by the natural cycles of life. Time was flexible, adaptable, and directly tied to the natural world. But in an agricultural society, time became more rigid. Planting and harvesting seasons became central to the rhythm of life, and the cultivation of crops demanded a fixed schedule. With the development of permanent settlements, daily life became more structured. People had to work within the constraints of time. Planting at certain times of the year, harvesting at others, and managing their food stores in anticipation of lean periods. Labor, too, became more specialized. In a society that relied heavily on agriculture, certain tasks were done at specific times of the year, while other tasks, such as food storage, preparation, and maintenance of tools, had to be carried out regularly. As a result, the work became divided not only by gender, as discussed previously, but also by function. Some members of the community worked the fields, while others focused on processing food, making tools, and crafting goods. This specialization of labor created a more complex social structure, and as the complexity of the work increased, so did the need for cooperation and coordination. The specialization of labor, however, was not limited to the practical tasks of farming and crafting. As societies began to settle and grow, they also developed cultural practices that required specialized skills. Early art, music, and religious rituals, for example, began to flourish in the context of settled life. Early humans who had once created cave paintings or carved small figurines began to develop more complex forms of artistic expression. They began to create pottery, woven textiles, and more intricate carvings. These forms of expression were not just for personal use. They became part of the fabric of the community, shared through rituals, ceremonies, and communal celebrations. Religious beliefs also began to evolve during this time. While early hunter-gatherer societies had animistic beliefs, seeing spirits in the land, animals, and natural forces, the rise of agriculture led to the development of more structured belief systems. These religious practices were often linked to the cycles of planting and harvesting, and they centered around the idea of fertility. Many early religions involved the worship of gods and deities associated with the earth, water, and harvest. These rituals were seen as necessary to ensure the fertility of the land and the success of the crops. Priests and religious leaders, who often held knowledge about the natural world, became important figures in early societies, guiding the people in their spiritual practices and overseeing rituals that were thought to influence the harvest and the seasons. As agriculture flourished and communities grew, so too did the complexity of early societies. The rise of agriculture and permanent settlements allowed for population growth, which in turn created the need for new forms of governance. Small, mobile groups had relied on simple forms of leadership, often based on age, wisdom, or skill. But in larger, settled communities, the need for more formal structures of leadership became apparent. Early human societies began to develop leaders, often elders or warriors, who had the power to make decisions for the group. These leaders were typically chosen based on their experience, wisdom, or ability to manage resources, and their authority was based on the trust and respect they had earned from the community. However, with the increase in population and the accumulation of wealth, came the need for systems of organization and regulation. As early settlements grew into villages and towns, the dynamics of leadership began to shift. The development of social hierarchies, as well as economic disparities, led to the emergence of more formalized systems of governance. Some groups began to establish rules and laws to manage resources, settle disputes, and protect the community from outside threats. These early forms of governance were rudimentary, but they laid the groundwork for the more complex political systems that would develop in the centuries to come. With these shifts in governance and leadership came a change in how early humans related to each other. The tight-knit, egalitarian structure of nomadic groups was gradually replaced by more stratified, hierarchical societies. This shift was not immediate, and early agricultural societies retained some elements of egalitarianism, especially in the smaller, less hierarchical communities. But the trend towards social differentiation based on land ownership, labor specialization, and religious authority became increasingly evident. As populations grew and resources were more intensively managed, the idea of inequality began to take root. In sum, the transition from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more sedentary, agricultural one was one of the most profound shifts in human history. It was not just about learning how to cultivate food or build permanent settlements. It was about redefining human relationships, time, labor, and power. The changes that began during this period set the foundation for the complex societies, economic systems, and governance structures that would later define human civilization. Yet, the early foundations of human life were still deeply connected to the natural world. The success of these early communities was, in many ways, still dependent on the earth, and the rhythms of nature. Even as these communities began to develop new systems of organization, leadership, and culture, they remained fundamentally tied to the land they inhabited, the resources they managed, and the environment that shaped their way of life. This was a time of profound change, but it was also a time when humans began to truly make their mark on the world, shaping the course of history with every decision, every harvest, and every innovation. As the shift towards settled agricultural life continued to unfold around 10,000 BCE, the impact on human communities became increasingly profound, not just in terms of food production and resource management, but in the ways people organized their lives and began to understand their place in the world. The world they lived in was still wild, untamed, and full of dangers, ranging from natural predators to the harsh unpredictability of the climate. But the changes were moving them toward a more controlled, structured way of life. Yet, even as humans learned to manipulate the environment to suit their needs, they could not escape the deep ties they still had to the land, the animals, and the natural world that shaped their survival. It was in this environment of profound change and adaptation that humans began to form early forms of culture, identity, and societal bonds. For early humans, living in a world that was still largely controlled by nature, the act of settling in one place for extended periods of time created new challenges. Unlike their nomadic ancestors, who were used to moving across vast expanses of land, these early agricultural societies began to face the complexities of permanence. The spaces they inhabited, once temporary camps, were now more defined and marked. People began to distinguish between what was theirs and what was the land. As these early societies grew, so too did their need for structures, physical, social, and spiritual, that would help them navigate their new way of life. At the heart of this transformation was the increasing importance of food storage, the capacity to store food, not just for immediate consumption, but for the lean months that would inevitably follow harvest, marked a significant shift in how early humans interacted with the environment. No longer did they need to depend solely on the wild bounty around them. The development of granaries and storage pits allowed early farmers to stockpile food, ensuring that they could survive in times of scarcity. This ability to store surplus food also led to the concept of accumulation, something that would later become central to the development of social inequality. With food stored away for future use, some individuals or families could accumulate wealth, and the idea of owning a surplus became a sign of status. As communities became more dependent on stored food, the need for organization and regulation became more apparent. Early humans began to recognize the value of surplus food, not only for its immediate usefulness, but for its potential as a form of power. Those who controlled the surplus controlled the stability of the community, and, by extension, their power. As a result, a new system of social relationships began to emerge, one that was rooted in the control and distribution of resources. The more surplus one had, the greater the power one could wield within the community. This growing stratification between those who had more and those who had less was a significant precursor to the social hierarchies that would later define larger, more complex societies. Along with this increase in material wealth, early humans also began to experience shifts in how they organized their labor. In nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, work was divided somewhat equally among group members, with men hunting and women gathering. However, as people began to settle and cultivate the land, specialized roles emerged. The need for more sophisticated farming practices led to the development of specialized skills. Some individuals became expert toolmakers, others became potters or weavers, and still others focused solely on farming. These roles were not just an efficient use of labor, they were part of the growing complexity of human society. As people learned to specialize, they began to depend on one another in ways they had not before. The community was no longer just a group of individuals working for their own survival. It was a network of interconnected roles, each vital to the functioning of the whole. This network of specialized labor, however, also created new challenges. As people became more specialized in their tasks, they became more dependent on each other. The division of labor meant that individuals no longer had the ability to provide for themselves in the same way they once had. A potter, for example, no longer gathered food or hunted animals, and the farmer did not make the tools he used to plant his crops. Instead, these individuals relied on each other. This increased interdependence was a positive development in many ways. It allowed societies to be more efficient, more productive, and more resilient, but it also marked the beginning of inequalities, as some roles were valued more highly than others. Those who controlled the land or held important leadership positions often found themselves in positions of power, while others, who performed labor-intensive tasks, found themselves in subservient roles. This growing inequality was not limited to the division of labor. It extended to the way land itself was distributed. As humans began to settle into more permanent homes and establish boundaries, the concept of land ownership began to take shape. No longer were people simply using the land temporarily, as they had during their nomadic existence. With the development of agriculture, land became a valuable resource, a resource that could be owned, inherited, and passed down through generations. This shift from common land use to private ownership marked a significant departure from the past and set the stage for the rise of wealth and power among those who controlled the land. The control of land, and by extension, the control of food, became one of the central forces shaping early human societies. In this new world, the idea of ownership was not just about physical land, but about control over resources. The ability to store and manage food was a source of power. Those who controlled the food supply held the key to the community's survival. This created a new dynamic within society, one that saw the emergence of social classes. As certain individuals or families amassed wealth, they gained influence and power. Over time, this influence translated into political power. Leaders and rulers began to emerge, figures who were often responsible for managing the land, allocating resources, and overseeing the distribution of food. The role of leadership became more structured, as leaders became increasingly responsible for maintaining the stability of the community and ensuring that resources were allocated fairly or unfairly, depending on the society. With the rise of these more complex social structures came new forms of conflict. While cooperation was essential to survival, competition was also inevitable. As resources became more valuable and scarce, the potential for conflict over land and food grew. The desire to control land and accumulate wealth led to the rise of power struggles and territorial disputes. Early humans were still living in a world where survival was not guaranteed, and as populations grew, so did the pressure on the land. This tension between cooperation and competition was at the heart of the early social transformations that took place during this period. Alongside these practical developments, early humans also began to confront deeper, existential questions. Settling in one place for extended periods of time forced people to consider their relationship to the land in more philosophical terms. The nomadic groups of the past had moved fluidly through the world, unconstrained by permanent boundaries. But as humans began to put down roots, they also began to think about their place within the greater scheme of the natural world. The earth was no longer just a backdrop to their survival. It was a partner in their existence, one that they relied upon and shaped in ways that would eventually redefine the relationship between humans and nature. As agriculture progressed, people began to develop a deeper understanding of cycles, seasonal cycles of planting and harvesting, as well as the cycles of life and death. These rhythms of the earth became a focal point for early religious practices, and as mentioned earlier, many early belief systems revolved around fertility and the agricultural cycles that sustained human life. The act of planting seeds and reaping the harvest was not just a physical act of survival, it was also seen as a deeply spiritual one. It connected early humans to the forces of nature in ways that were both practical and transcendent. In this context, early religious practices and rituals grew more complex. As communities settled and began to thrive, religion played an increasingly important role in maintaining social order and promoting cooperation. Temples, shrines, and sacred spaces began to emerge, serving as focal points for community life. These religious centers not only provided spiritual guidance, but also became places for social gathering, dispute resolution, and governance. The rise of religious leaders and priests further solidified the connection between governance and spirituality. Religious authority and political authority became intertwined, and the rulers who held sway over land and resources often did so with the backing of religious institutions. Thus, as early humans learned to control their environment, to manage their food, and to navigate increasingly complex social structures, they began to define the very essence of what it meant to live in a settled agricultural society. These early settlements, still simple by modern standards, represented the first steps towards civilization. They were not merely groups of people huddling together for survival. They were the foundations of something far more profound, complex societies in which power, resources, and human relationships were redefined in ways that would echo throughout history. The development of settled communities around 10,000 BCE marked a pivotal moment in human history, as early humans began to transition from a nomadic existence to a sedentary lifestyle. They were not merely adapting to new ways of life. They were laying the groundwork for all the complexity and innovation that would follow. The implications of this shift were profound, affecting nearly every aspect of human existence, from food production to social organization, religious practices, and even the way humans understood their relationship to the natural world. At the core of this transformation was the rise of agriculture, which provided the foundation for more permanent settlements, no longer reliant on the sporadic availability of wild plants or the movements of animal herds. Early humans began to take control of the land. They learned to plant seeds, nurture crops, and harvest food in a deliberate, predictable manner. This process, which began with the domestication of plants like wheat, barley, and legumes, gradually spread across the globe, shaping the course of human history. The ability to cultivate food in one place and store it for future use was nothing short of revolutionary. It allowed for the development of surplus food supplies, which in turn enabled communities to grow in size and complexity. But agriculture was not the only factor that contributed to the rise of settled life. The development of new technologies, such as advanced tools for farming, weaving, and pottery, also played a crucial role. As humans became more adept at shaping their environment, they invented tools that made life easier and more efficient. The plow, for example, allowed for more effective tilling of the soil, while pottery enabled people to store food and water for longer periods. The ability to create more durable and specialized tools was another step toward the increasing complexity of human society. It was through these technologies that humans were able to not only survive, but thrive in one place, creating communities that could endure for generations. However, with the rise of permanent settlements came new challenges, particularly in the realm of social organization. As people began to live in closer proximity to one another, the need for structure and order became increasingly important. No longer could decisions be made by consensus, as was often the case in small nomadic groups. In larger, more complex communities, leadership became essential. Leaders, whether they were elders, warriors, or skilled craftsmen, began to emerge to guide the group. These leaders were often tasked with making decisions about resource distribution, defense, and conflict resolution. They helped to maintain social cohesion and ensure the survival of the group. But as the size and complexity of these communities grew, so did the need for a more formalized system of governance. The rise of agriculture and the accumulation of surplus food led to the development of property rights and the concept of land ownership. This shift in how people viewed the land had significant consequences. For the first time in history, humans began to think of land as something to be owned, controlled, and passed down from generation to generation. With the establishment of private property came the emergence of social hierarchies. Those who controlled the land and the food were able to amass power, while others who had less access to resources were relegated to lower social positions. At the same time, the rise of permanent settlements also had a profound impact on family structures. In nomadic societies, families were often fluid and flexible, with individuals moving freely within the group. But in settled communities, family roles became more defined. Men typically became responsible for tasks such as hunting, defense, and leadership, while women took on roles related to food production, child rearing, and domestic labor. This division of labor was reinforced by the new structures of social hierarchy that emerged within settled communities. With the growing importance of agriculture, women's roles in food production became central to the survival of the community. However, this also led to an increase in gendered roles and the reinforcement of traditional power dynamics. As agricultural societies grew in size and complexity, so did the need for more advanced forms of communication. Early humans had relied on oral traditions to pass down knowledge, stories, and cultural practices. But as settlements grew and communities became more specialized, the need for written communication emerged. Writing systems began to evolve, allowing people to record transactions, keep track of resources, and document religious and legal codes. Earliest forms of writing were simple pictographs and symbols, but over time, these would develop into more complex scripts. The development of writing marked a significant leap forward in human civilization, as it allowed for the recording of history and the establishment of laws and customs that could be passed down through generations. At the same time, religion and spirituality continued to play a central role in the lives of early humans. In nomadic societies, religious beliefs were often tied to the natural world, with animistic practices that saw spirits in animals, plants, and natural forces. But as humans began to settle in one place, their religious beliefs became more organized. Temples and shrines were built to honor gods and spirits associated with the land, fertility, and the harvest. These early religious practices often centered around rituals that ensured the success of the crops and the fertility of the land. Religion became an integral part of daily life, shaping the way people thought about the world and their place in it. The rise of agriculture and permanent settlements also had a profound impact on the environment. As humans cleared land for farming, they began to alter the landscape in ways that had never been done before. Forests were cleared, rivers were diverted, and the natural balance of ecosystems was disrupted. While these changes allowed humans to thrive, they also created long-term environmental consequences. The domestication of animals, such as cattle, sheep, and goats, led to an increase in livestock farming, which further altered the landscape. Overgrazing, soil depletion, and deforestation began to take their toll on the environment. As early humans learned to control their environment, they also learned that their actions had consequences. With the rise of settled life came the need for larger and more complex settlements. Early agricultural villages began to evolve into towns and cities. These cities were often built around central locations, such as rivers, which provided water for crops and trade routes for the exchange of goods. The growth of cities brought with it the development of new technologies, new forms of social organization, and new ways of thinking about the world. These cities became the focal points of early civilizations, and the people who lived in them began to see themselves as part of something larger than just their immediate community. They began to think in terms of cities, regions, and nations, laying the foundation for the complex political and social systems that would later emerge. However, the rise of cities also brought with it new problems. As populations grew, so did competition for resources. The need for food, water, and land became increasingly important, and the potential for conflict over these resources grew. Early cities often found themselves engaged in territorial disputes, with neighboring groups vying for control of fertile land or valuable trade routes. Warfare became an increasingly common feature of human societies, as groups fought to protect their resources and expand their territory. Despite these challenges, the rise of settled life set the stage for the development of the complex civilizations that would follow. It marked the beginning of an era in which humans began to shape their environment, create new technologies, and organize themselves into complex social structures. The agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, and the emergence of writing and religion all contributed to the development of human civilization. Yet, it was not just the innovations and advancements that defined this period. It was also the profound shift in how humans viewed themselves and their relationship to the world around them. As humans learned to manipulate the environment and organize their societies, they began to see themselves as active participants in shaping the course of history. They no longer viewed themselves as passive beings at the mercy of nature's whims. Instead, they began to understand their role in the natural world and their capacity to change it. This newfound sense of agency would continue to evolve, leading to the rise of new technologies, new political systems, and new ways of thinking about the world. This shift to settled life was not just a change in how humans lived, it was a change in how they thought about themselves, their place in the world, and their capacity to shape the future. In the end, the story of settled life is the story of human ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. It is a tale of how early humans overcame the challenges of a rapidly changing world and created the foundations of civilization through agriculture, technology, social organization, and religion. They began to build a new way of life, one that would set the stage for everything that would follow. This period of transition, though it may seem distant in time, continues to echo through human history, influencing the ways we live, think, and relate to the world around us. As the transition to settled life continued to evolve, one of the most critical and transformative developments that began to shape human societies was the advent of trade. Early human societies, primarily engaged in agriculture, began to accumulate surplus goods, primarily food, tools, and other essentials. This accumulation of resources naturally led to the need for exchange. As settlements grew and diversified, the desire to acquire goods and materials that could not be produced locally gave rise to trade networks that spanned vast regions. The flow of goods and resources began to shape not only the economic structure of these early communities, but also their social dynamics, leading to greater interconnectedness and the gradual emergence of a more complex global economy. Trade, in its simplest form, was based on barter, exchanging goods directly for other goods. However, as these exchanges became more frequent and varied, the limitations of barter began to surface. A person who raised cattle, for example, might have no interest in grain, yet might still need it for their community. Similarly, a potter might have a surplus of pottery, but need something that no one in their immediate vicinity could provide. The need for a more universal form of exchange emerged, one that could facilitate transactions between individuals who did not necessarily have a direct need for each other's goods. This need gave rise to early forms of currency, which varied greatly in different cultures. Early currencies were often commodities themselves, such as grains, shells, or precious metals, that were widely accepted as a medium of exchange. The rise of trade and the development of early currencies were not merely practical advancements. They marked a shift in how people thought about wealth and resources. With trade, goods were no longer simply consumed by the individual or the community in which they were produced. Instead, they became part of a larger, interconnected economic system. This new understanding of resources required a shift in how people viewed ownership and value. Whereas land and food had once been the central sources of wealth, now the ability to acquire and control goods from distant lands became a sign of economic power. The ability to accumulate wealth through trade meant that individuals and communities who were able to establish trade routes gained significant influence, while those who lacked access to such routes remained isolated and vulnerable. Alongside the development of trade, early societies also began to develop more sophisticated forms of governance to regulate economic activity. The need to manage resources, protect trade routes, and ensure fairness in exchanges led to the establishment of early forms of law and order. In smaller, more isolated communities, leaders were typically chosen for their wisdom or their ability to resolve disputes. However, as communities grew and became more interconnected through trade, the need for formalized systems of governance became more apparent. This led to the creation of rudimentary legal systems designed to regulate the flow of goods, protect merchants, and ensure that trade was conducted fairly. In some societies, early rulers or chieftains imposed taxes on goods in exchange for protection or the maintenance of infrastructure, such as roads and marketplaces. The development of trade also led to the rise of specialized professions. As certain goods became more valuable or more sought after, individuals began to specialize in particular forms of craftsmanship. The skilled artisans emerged, creating intricate tools, pottery, textiles, and other items that were in demand both locally and in distant lands. This specialization allowed communities to develop higher levels of expertise in specific areas of production, leading to an increase in the quality and diversity of goods available for trade. For example, certain regions became known for their high-quality pottery or metalwork, and people from other communities would travel long distances to acquire these specialized goods. In this way, trade facilitated the exchange, not just of food and raw materials, but also of culture, knowledge, and technological innovation. The rise of trade and the accompanying specialization also had significant social and cultural implications. As trade routes expanded, people from different cultures began to come into contact with one another more frequently. This exchange of goods and ideas led to the blending of cultures and the diffusion of technological and artistic innovations. For instance, the development of metalworking techniques spread across different regions through trade, as did the use of new farming tools and irrigation systems. Cultural practices and religious beliefs also spread along these trade routes, contributing to the development of shared traditions and rituals between distant peoples. Yet, trade and the increasing complexity of human societies were not without their challenges. As trade expanded, so did the competition for resources. Rival communities, or even entire civilizations, began to vie for control over trade routes, and conflict over valuable resources became more common. The need for protection of trade routes led to the rise of early forms of military organization. Leaders or rulers who controlled trade routes often maintained standing armies to protect their wealth and ensure the safety of merchants traveling through their lands. This increased militarization contributed to the development of early kingdoms and empires, where rulers wielded significant power not only through economic control, but also through military might. These early empires were often centered around key trade hubs, cities that grew into centers of commerce, culture, and governance. In many cases, these cities were located near rivers or other bodies of water, which provided transportation routes for goods. These cities became the focal points of power, as they controlled the flow of goods and resources between regions. The people who lived in these cities were often among the wealthiest and most influential, as they had direct access to the goods coming from distant lands. These urban centers also became the sites of cultural exchange, where merchants, artisans, and scholars from different regions came together to share ideas, art, and knowledge. The concentration of wealth in these cities, however, also led to greater social stratification. While some individuals became incredibly wealthy through trade and specialized labor, others remained poor, working in menial jobs or as laborers. This division between the wealthy elites and the lower classes contributed to the development of class systems in early societies. Those who controlled the flow of goods were able to amass wealth and political power, while those who were less fortunate were often relegated to lower social positions. This created a new dynamic within human societies, one that was based not just on kinship or physical strength, but on economic power. One of the most significant outcomes of this growing social inequality was the emergence of early forms of statecraft. Rulers, often selected from the wealthiest classes, began to consolidate power through the control of resources and the protection of trade routes. The idea of a centralized authority, responsible for governing a region and managing its economic resources, began to take shape. In many cases, these early rulers were seen as divine figures, believed to have been chosen by the gods to rule over their people. The intertwining of religious and political power helped to legitimize their authority and provided the rulers with the support of the population. Trade also contributed to the rise of early urbanization. As cities grew, they became the focal points for commerce, culture, and administration. Urban centers allowed for the accumulation of wealth, the development of specialized labor, and the creation of public works, such as roads, bridges, and marketplaces. These urban centers also became the sites of monumental architecture, temples, palaces, and public buildings that symbolized the power and authority of the rulers. The growth of cities marked a turning point in human history, as humans moved from small, rural communities to larger, more complex urban environments. Despite the challenges that came with the rise of trade, it was clear that the shift to settled life and the development of trade networks were transformative forces in the development of human societies. The flow of goods, ideas, and people across vast distances fostered a level of interconnectedness that had never before been seen in human history. This interconnectedness not only promoted economic growth, but also laid the foundation for the complex political, social, and cultural systems that would eventually give rise to the first great civilizations. In this new world of trade and interconnectedness, human societies began to redefine themselves. They were no longer isolated groups of individuals scattered across the landscape. Instead, they were part of a global network, one that connected distant peoples and cultures in ways that had never before been possible. Through trade, humans began to exchange not only material goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. They learned from one another, adapted to new ways of thinking, and, in many cases, forged new identities that transcended their individual communities. This period of trade and cultural exchange marked a new chapter in human history, one that would shape the course of civilization for centuries to come. As human societies continued to evolve during the period around 10,000 BCE, one of the most significant transformations in the development of civilization was the rise of complex religious systems. These systems, often deeply intertwined with the structures of governance, social organization, and the very fabric of daily life, played a central role in shaping the way people understood the world, their place in it, and their relationships with the forces that governed their existence. In many ways, religion became the backbone of early societies, providing not only a moral and ethical framework, but also a means of unifying people, defining social roles, and maintaining order in increasingly larger, more diverse communities. At the heart of these early religious systems was the need to explain the world and its mysteries. Early humans, still living in a world that was full of danger, uncertainty, and the unpredictable forces of nature, looked to religion to provide answers to fundamental questions. Why do the seasons change? What causes the storms? What happens after death? These questions, which remain at the core of human curiosity today, were especially urgent for early agricultural societies that depended on the land for their survival. For them, understanding the cycles of nature, of planting and harvesting, of life and death, was essential, not only for survival, but for the stability of their communities. Religion in these early societies often took on a polytheistic nature, with multiple gods and spirits representing different aspects of the natural world. These deities were often associated with forces that early humans could neither control nor fully understand. The sun, the moon, the wind, the rain, the fertility of the soil, and the harvest. Each of these elements played a crucial role in ensuring the survival of agricultural communities, and as such, the deities connected to them were deeply revered. The gods and goddesses of these early religions were not just abstract concepts or philosophical ideals. They were living, active forces, believed to influence the daily lives of people in tangible ways. To appease these gods and ensure the continuation of their blessings, people offered prayers, sacrifices, and rituals, which were meant to maintain harmony between the human world and the divine. In many early societies, the importance of fertility was central to religious beliefs. The cycles of birth, growth, death, and rebirth that governed both human life and the natural world were mirrored in the religious rituals of the time. These rituals often centered around the planting and harvesting seasons, as these were the times when the survival of the community was most at risk. Fertility rituals were performed to ensure a bountiful harvest, and the fertility of the soil, crops, and animals was often linked to the fertility of women, the goddesses, or nature itself. In some societies, these rituals involved symbolic acts, such as the planting of sacred seeds or the reenactment of mythological stories that involved gods or spirits who ensured the fertility of the land. While early religious practices were closely tied to the agricultural cycles, they were also influenced by the need to govern the increasingly complex and stratified social structures that were emerging. As societies grew larger and more settled, the role of religion became increasingly intertwined with the role of leadership. The rulers of these early agricultural societies often positioned themselves as intermediaries between the gods and the people. This connection to the divine gave rulers a certain level of authority and legitimacy, as they were seen as having a divine mandate to lead their people. In many cases, kings or chieftains were believed to be chosen by the gods, or even to be divine themselves, reinforcing their power and their central role in both the governance and spiritual life of the community. In these early societies, religion also played a critical role in organizing and maintaining social order. Religious laws and taboos helped define acceptable behavior, determine social roles, and regulate relationships within the community. For example, religious codes often governed everything from the treatment of the land and animals to the roles of men and women, the organization of labor, and even the distribution of resources. These religious laws were seen not just as human-made rules, but as divine instructions handed down by the gods to ensure the prosperity and stability of society. Violating these laws, therefore, was considered not only a crime against the community, but a sin against the divine order itself. The construction of religious sites, such as temples and shrines, also began to take root during this period. These buildings were not only places of worship, but also symbols of the growing complexity of early civilizations. Temples were often the focal point of religious and social life, serving as centers for ritual ceremonies, community gatherings, and the collection of offerings. They were typically constructed with great care, often using the best available materials, and were often positioned in prominent locations, such as near rivers or on elevated ground, to symbolize their connection to the divine. The elaborate architecture of these religious buildings reflected the importance of religion in the lives of early people, as well as the growing organizational and technical capabilities of these societies. Alongside these monumental structures, the development of religious iconography began to emerge. Statues, carvings, and symbols representing gods, spirits, and other religious figures became common in many early societies. These images served as physical representations of the divine, helping to make the abstract forces of religion more tangible and accessible to the people. The act of creating and venerating these religious symbols was an important part of religious practice, as it reinforced the connection between the human world and the divine. In many societies, religious leaders and priests were responsible for overseeing the creation and maintenance of these symbols, further solidifying their authority and influence within the community. The rise of organized religion also led to the development of priesthoods and religious elites. In many early agricultural societies, the role of the priest was distinct from that of other leaders, such as warriors or farmers. Priests were seen as the guardians of religious knowledge and rituals, and they often held a special place within the social hierarchy. Because religion was so deeply intertwined with the survival of the community, the priesthood was a powerful position. Priests had the knowledge and authority to interpret the will of the gods and to communicate with the divine through rituals, sacrifices, and prayers. This made them essential not only in religious matters but in political and social ones as well. In some societies, religious leaders were even the ones who appointed rulers or had a direct influence on political decisions. As religion became more formalized and entrenched within these societies, it began to spread to neighboring regions and cultures. Trade routes, often the lifeblood of early civilizations, became the pathways through which religious ideas and practices spread. Merchants, travelers, and explorers brought not only goods but also stories, beliefs, and rituals that began to influence distant peoples. This exchange of religious ideas contributed to the development of broader belief systems, which would eventually give rise to the major religions that have shaped human history. As religions spread, they often adapted to the local customs and practices, blending with indigenous beliefs to create new forms of spirituality. This syncretism allowed for the coexistence of different belief systems within the same region, leading to the development of complex religious landscapes. While religion was essential for maintaining social order and governance in these early agricultural societies, it also served as a means of coping with the existential challenges that humans faced. Life, with its uncertainties, dangers, and hardships, was unpredictable and often harsh. Disease, famine, natural disasters, and violent conflict were constant threats, and early humans sought comfort in the belief that there was a higher power watching over them. Religion provided not only explanations for these misfortunes, but also a way to cope with them. Through ritual, prayer, and sacrifice, people sought to appease the gods, asking for protection, fertility, and prosperity. The belief that they were part of a larger divine plan gave people hope and meaning, even in the most difficult times. Furthermore, religion also provided a way to explain the mysteries of life and death. As humans began to bury their dead and create elaborate burial practices, they developed beliefs about the afterlife. These beliefs varied from culture to culture, but the central idea was that death was not the end, but rather a transition to another realm. The dead were often believed to continue to have influence over the living, and proper burial rituals were seen as essential for ensuring a peaceful journey into the afterlife. This connection between life, death, and the divine further solidified the role of religion in early human societies, giving it a central place in both everyday life and in times of crisis. In the end, the rise of religion during this period was not just a response to the need for survival. It was a manifestation of the human desire to understand the world and make sense of the forces that shaped their lives. As early humans moved from a nomadic, survival-focused existence to settled agricultural societies, religion became a cornerstone of their identity. It helped to define who they were, what they believed, and how they related to the world around them. Through religion, early societies found ways to cope with their fears, desires, and uncertainties, and in doing so, they laid the foundations for the complex belief systems that would shape civilizations for millennia to come. As the development of agricultural societies progressed and trade began to shape the economic and social landscape, human beings found themselves increasingly interconnected, not just with their environment, but with one another. The need to cooperate, manage resources, and share knowledge gave rise to a deeper sense of social interdependence, marking the shift from individual survival to community well-being. This profound shift was not merely practical, but also psychological, as it introduced new social dynamics, structures, and collective responsibilities. The creation of larger, more permanent settlements necessitated new forms of cooperation, leading to the birth of social institutions that would shape human societies for millennia. At the heart of this shift was the increasing complexity of social relations. In smaller, more mobile groups, relationships were often based on direct, face-to-face interactions, and cooperation was typically governed by personal relationships and shared goals. The emergence of permanent settlements, however, created the need for more formalized systems of governance, labor, and resource distribution. It was no longer possible to rely solely on personal bonds to ensure the smooth functioning of a community. As societies grew larger and more diverse, new structures and mechanisms had to be put in place to maintain order and stability. One of the earliest and most crucial social institutions to emerge in these settled communities was the family. While families had always been central to human survival, the nature of the family structure began to evolve as people moved away from the nomadic lifestyle. In earlier, hunter-gatherer societies, families were often fluid, with individuals moving freely within the group. In agricultural societies, however, the family became more fixed, with defined roles and responsibilities. Men typically took on tasks related to farming, hunting, or defense, while women were more often responsible for domestic work, food preparation, and child rearing. This division of labor, while practical for survival, also reinforced gender roles and created a more hierarchical structure within the family unit. The concept of the family, however, also expanded beyond the nuclear household. As communities grew and settled in one place, extended families, comprising multiple generations and branches of kin, became more common. The importance of lineage and ancestry began to take on greater significance, with the preservation of family heritage becoming an important social concern. Family ties became central to the social fabric, and the collective well-being of extended families or clans was often seen as essential to the survival of the larger community. This emphasis on kinship and family networks also laid the groundwork for the development of more complex social hierarchies, as certain families or clans began to acquire wealth, land, or power, setting them apart from others. As the need for more formalized social structures grew, leadership became a crucial element in organizing these expanding communities. Initially, leadership was often based on physical strength, wisdom, or experience, with elders or warriors taking on the role of decision makers. However, as agricultural societies became more complex, leadership began to take on a more institutionalized form. This led to the rise of chieftains, kings, and rulers who not only had authority over land and resources, but also over the social and religious life of their people. The emergence of leadership as a distinct social role was not just a matter of authority, it was also a reflection of the growing complexity of human society. Rulers, now seen as responsible for the welfare of the community, were tasked with maintaining order, regulating trade, and ensuring the stability of the agricultural cycle. The concept of power began to evolve during this period, with rulers gaining more control over resources, labor, and the very structure of society. While early societies were often governed by a council of elders or a system of shared leadership, the growing complexity of agricultural life required more centralized forms of authority. Leaders, whether kings, chiefs, or religious figures, became responsible not only for overseeing the day-to-day affairs of their people, but also for making strategic decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and external relations. This shift towards centralized power was both practical and symbolic, as it helped to create more cohesive and organized communities. Rulers began to claim divine or semi-divine status, using religion as a tool to legitimize their authority and ensure that their rule was accepted by the people. Alongside the rise of formal leadership came the emergence of social hierarchies. As wealth and resources began to accumulate in settled communities, the distinction between different classes within society became more pronounced. In the early days of agricultural societies, all members of the community were more or less equal in terms of their access to resources and their roles in society. However, as communities grew, so did the differentiation of labor and wealth. Those who controlled the land, food production, or trade routes began to accumulate wealth, while those who worked in less specialized or lower status jobs found themselves at the bottom of the social ladder. This growing inequality led to the emergence of distinct social classes, with landowners, rulers, and religious elites occupying the top positions, and farmers, laborers, and craftsmen forming the lower classes. The development of social classes was not only a consequence of the growing complexity of agricultural societies, but also a reflection of the way that power and resources were distributed. As societies became more sedentary, the ability to accumulate wealth became increasingly important. Those who had control over land and food supplies were able to exert influence over the rest of the community, and this control gave them a higher social status. The accumulation of wealth through trade and agriculture became a symbol of power, and as a result, those with the most wealth were often able to control the decisions that affected the entire community. This process of stratification was often legitimized through religious or cultural ideologies, which reinforced the belief that those in power were divinely chosen or had been granted their wealth through their moral or spiritual superiority. With the rise of social classes came the need for systems of justice and dispute resolution. In earlier, smaller communities, conflicts could often be resolved through personal negotiation or through the intervention of community elders. However, as societies grew larger and more complex, formal legal systems began to emerge. These systems were designed not only to maintain order, but also to regulate the relationships between different social classes. The idea of law as a divine or moral code, handed down by the gods or the rulers, became central to the development of early legal systems. These laws were often codified and became part of the social contract that governed society. The growing complexity of social hierarchies meant that legal systems had to adapt to address new forms of inequality and conflict, and this adaptation laid the groundwork for the more formalized legal structures that would eventually emerge in later civilizations. The development of early systems of governance and law also marked the beginning of more formalized education and knowledge transmission. As societies became more complex, The need for specialized knowledge, ranging from agricultural techniques to religious rituals and legal codes, became more pronounced. The emergence of literacy and the ability to record knowledge was crucial in the development of these early societies. While most people were still engaged in agricultural work, a small elite began to emerge who were trained in reading, writing, and the interpretation of religious or legal texts. This class of scribes, priests, and scholars played a central role in maintaining and transmitting the knowledge that supported the functioning of society. Education in these early societies was not only about the transmission of practical skills, but also about the preservation and propagation of cultural and religious knowledge. The advent of social hierarchies and the formalization of governance also created new opportunities for artistic and intellectual expression. As early communities became more stable and prosperous, the resources to support artistic endeavors became more available. The construction of monumental architecture, such as temples, palaces, and public buildings, became a central feature of many early civilizations. Art, in these contexts, was often used to communicate religious or political ideas, to celebrate rulers and deities, and to establish cultural identity. In addition to visual art, early societies also began to develop music, poetry, and other forms of artistic expression that served both social and spiritual purposes. At the same time, the growing complexity of social life also meant that people were more exposed to external influences. Trade routes not only facilitated the exchange of goods, but also ideas and technologies. As different cultures came into contact, they exchanged religious beliefs, artistic styles, and knowledge, further enriching the cultural landscape. This exchange of ideas contributed to the diversity of thought and expression that characterized early human societies, laying the foundation for the development of more advanced cultural, scientific, and philosophical systems. In sum, the rise of settled agricultural life and the subsequent emergence of complex social structures marked a fundamental shift in human history. No longer could people rely solely on kinship ties or personal relationships to govern their lives. Instead, they created systems of governance, law, and social organization that were more formalized and complex. These systems were shaped by the growing need for cooperation, resource management, and social stability in increasingly large and diverse communities. As people adapted to the new realities of settled life, they also developed new ways of thinking about themselves, their communities, and their place in the world. The foundations of social, political, and cultural life that were laid during this period continue to influence human societies to this day. As human societies continue to settle and develop, one of the most profound and lasting transformations that emerged was the growth of urbanization. While early agricultural villages were small, often scattered communities that were closely tied to the land, the rise of permanent settlements eventually led to the creation of cities. These early cities, though primitive by modern standards, represented a fundamental shift in the way humans lived and interacted with one another. They marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one that would shape the trajectory of civilization for thousands of years to come. Urbanization, in its simplest form, is the process by which a society becomes more focused on cities and towns, as opposed to rural areas. It is driven by a number of factors, including population growth, economic development, and the increasing complexity of social and political systems. As early agricultural societies began to produce more food and resources, they were able to support larger populations. This increase in population density created the conditions necessary for the growth of towns and cities. The abundance of resources, particularly food, enabled people to settle in one place and build permanent homes, while the need for greater organization and specialization prompted the development of more complex social, political, and economic systems. The rise of cities was closely linked to the growth of trade and commerce. As settled communities became more productive, they began to produce surplus goods, which could be exchanged with other communities. Over time, these exchanges grew beyond the local level, eventually reaching distant regions and foreign cultures. Trade became a central pillar of urban life, and cities became the hubs through which goods, people, and ideas flowed. In this sense, the development of cities was not just about the concentration of people in one place, but about the creation of networks of exchange and interaction that spanned across vast distances. The growth of cities also brought with it an increase in specialization and division of labor. In smaller villages, individuals were often involved in a variety of activities: farming, hunting, crafting, and so on. But as cities grew and became more complex, people began to specialize in particular trades or crafts. This specialization was made possible by the surplus of food and resources generated by agriculture. With food production taken care of, individuals had the time and opportunity to pursue other skills and trades. Pottery, weaving, metalworking, and carpentry became specialized occupations, and artisans could focus their energy on perfecting their craft. This specialization allowed for greater efficiency and innovation, leading to the development of more advanced technologies and products. As the need for specialized labor grew, so did the demand for markets and trade centers. The rise of the marketplace became a defining feature of urban life. Markets provided a place for people to exchange goods, but they also became centers of social interaction and cultural exchange. Goods from far-flung regions were brought to the market, and people from different backgrounds, cultures, and walks of life converged to trade, socialize, and share ideas. The marketplace became a vibrant, bustling space where the economic, social, and cultural life of the city intersected. It was here that people from all walks of life, farmers, merchants, artisans, and rulers, came together to shape the dynamics of urban society. However, the growth of cities was not without its challenges. As populations grew and cities became more densely packed, new problems arose. One of the most pressing concerns was the management of resources, particularly water. Early cities, especially those in arid or semi-arid regions, had to find ways to ensure a reliable water supply for their growing populations. This led to the development of sophisticated systems of irrigation, aqueducts, and wells, which allowed people to control the flow of water and ensure that it was available for both agricultural and domestic purposes. The management of water resources became a central concern for urban planners and rulers, and the success or failure of a city was often tied to its ability to manage this vital resource. The challenges of urbanization were not limited to resource management. As cities grew, so did social inequality. In the early days of agriculture, most people had access to land and resources, and social hierarchies were relatively simple. However, with the rise of cities and the concentration of wealth and power, inequality became more pronounced. Those who controlled the trade routes, the land, and the resources of the city grew wealthier, while those who had fewer resources or specialized in low-status work found themselves at the bottom of the social ladder. The division of labor became more pronounced, and social stratification deepened. Wealthy elites lived in grand houses or palaces, while the majority of the population lived in cramped, poorly constructed dwellings. This inequality became a defining feature of urban life, and it led to tensions between different social classes. These tensions often played out in the political realm. In early agricultural societies, leadership was often decentralized, with decisions made by councils of elders or community leaders. However, as cities grew in size and complexity, the need for more centralized leadership became apparent. This led to the rise of kings, emperors, and other forms of centralized rule. Rulers in urban societies were responsible for maintaining order, regulating trade, and ensuring the stability of the city. They often derived their power from both religious and political sources, using their divine or semi-divine status to legitimize their rule. The concentration of power in the hands of a single leader or a small elite further exacerbated social inequality and created the conditions for political unrest. Despite these challenges, urbanization brought about a number of significant advancements. The rise of cities facilitated the development of written language, which allowed for the recording of history, the codification of laws, and the transmission of knowledge. Writing systems, which had first emerged in agricultural societies to keep track of trade and resources, became more sophisticated as cities grew. Early writing systems, such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphs in Egypt, were used to record everything from royal decrees to religious texts to commercial transactions. The ability to record and transmit information allowed urban societies to build on previous knowledge, leading to further advancements in science, technology, and culture. Another important development that emerged in urban centers was the creation of monumental architecture. Early cities were often home to large, impressive structures that symbolized the power and importance of the city and its rulers. Temples, palaces, and city walls were constructed using advanced techniques and materials, such as mud brick, stone, and wood. These structures served both practical and symbolic purposes. They were designed to protect the city from external threats, to house religious rituals, and to showcase the wealth and power of the rulers. Monumental architecture became a key feature of urban life, serving as a reminder of the city's greatness and the authority of its rulers. Urbanization also led to the development of new forms of art and culture. In early cities, the concentration of wealth and resources allowed for the patronage of artists, musicians, and craftsmen. These urban centers became hubs of creativity, where new artistic forms and cultural expressions could flourish. Art, literature, music, and theater became integral parts of urban life, reflecting the values, beliefs, and aspirations of the people. The exchange of ideas between different cultures and regions also contributed to the diversity of artistic and cultural expression in urban societies. As cities grew, they became more than just centers of economic and political activity. They became places where people could come together to share ideas, debate issues, and create new forms of social and cultural life. Cities provided a space for the development of philosophy, science, and literature. Intellectuals, scholars, and religious leaders gathered in urban centers to discuss ideas and debate the nature of the universe, the role of humanity, and the meaning of life. The growth of cities thus provided the intellectual and cultural foundation for the development of complex civilizations. Urbanization, however, was not a smooth process. While cities offered new opportunities for trade, specialization, and cultural exchange, they also brought about significant challenges. The growth of cities often led to overcrowding, pollution, and disease. Early cities, lacking the sanitation and infrastructure that we take for granted today, were breeding grounds for disease. The close proximity of people, combined with poor sanitation, created the conditions for the spread of infectious diseases, which could devastate populations. These health challenges, along with the constant threat of war and conflict, made life in early cities precarious and uncertain. Despite these challenges, urbanization laid the foundation for the development of complex civilizations. The growth of cities, driven by agricultural surpluses, trade, and specialization, provided the conditions for the emergence of writing, monumental architecture, and intellectual achievement. Urban centers became the focal points of political, economic, and cultural life, shaping the trajectory of human history for thousands of years. Through their struggles and achievements, early cities helped to shape the human experience, creating the blueprint for the civilizations that would follow. They stand as a testament to humanity's ability to adapt, innovate, and create communities that transcend the boundaries of geography and time. As the complexity of early civilizations deepened with the rise of urbanization, the need for greater control and organization of resources, governance, and social structures became more pronounced. The increasingly sophisticated societies that developed in these urban centers required a framework to manage not only their political and economic systems, but also their religious and cultural institutions. This need for organization led to the emergence of laws, formalized social norms, and bureaucratic systems that would shape the functioning of early cities and eventually define the structure of modern civilizations. One of the most significant developments during this period was the codification of laws. Before written laws, most societies operated on a system of customary rules and traditions passed down orally from one generation to the next. While these unwritten rules helped maintain order in small, tight-knit communities, they were insufficient for managing the growing complexity of urban life. As cities expanded and became centers of trade, governance, and cultural exchange, the need for a standardized set of laws became essential. This legal codification ensured that rules were clear, enforced consistently, and applied to everyone, regardless of social standing or wealth. The earliest examples of written laws emerged in Mesopotamia, where the famous Code of Hammurabi was created around 1754 BCE. The code, one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal documents, was carved into stone and displayed publicly, so that all citizens could read and understand the laws governing their lives. It covered a wide range of subjects, from trade and property rights to marriage, family matters, and criminal offenses. The Code of Hammurabi also introduced the idea of an eye for an eye, a principle of retributive justice that became a foundational concept in many legal systems that followed.